Okay, good morning, everybody. Hope you're all doing well. Just want to make sure that you're all connected up with course resources. If you're not getting the book or the slides or podcasts or a syllabus or any of that, let me know as soon as possible, and I will do whatever I can to facilitate your contact with the material. Emily and I have office hours, so please take advantage of those. I have one tomorrow at 11, so come by if you want. Today, this is our third lecture, and it's important to recognize, I think, that we've accomplished two things so far in this class. One is we've identified the scope of what we're interested in. We've put some boundaries around it with definitions about what is and is not an intimate relationship. I'm going to expect you to know that. I'm also going to expect you to know the intrinsic and extrinsic reasons why we care about intimate relationships. And most importantly, I want you to recognize that what we're doing in this class is focusing on one critical question, and that is why are relationships sometimes tremendously uplifting, and why are they at other times very difficult? So we're asking a question about what makes relationships thrive and what makes relationships falter. And because relationships have such powerful extrinsic consequences for the people involved, for the families, for kids who are being raised, we have to answer this question. And because that question is so important, people have diverse opinions about why relationships succeed and fail, about why they thrive, about why they falter. And that's the second important accomplishment that we've made so far, which is in our last class we talked about how we would adjudicate, how we would decide between different competing perspectives, and we talked about different research methods that would enable us to collect information that would help us get closer to the answer to that question that we care so much about, the thriving versus faltering question, okay? So that's where we are today. We're now moving into our third chapter. So you can see this is the discussion of theoretical frameworks that we might bring to bear to understand relationships. And we care about theoretical frameworks for this kind of idea. This is Henri Poincaré, a French mathematician, and he reminded us that science is not just about collecting individual bits of knowledge. It's about seeing them in their totality. It's about putting pieces of information alongside one another so that we actually evolve toward an understanding. We're not in the business just to collect more information. That's what the previous lecture would have led you to believe, right? That we're just out there using research methods, collecting little bits of information, and each one shows up in the newspaper, and it turns out to be important or interesting in some way. What we're really trying to achieve is a more enduring understanding, and that's why I like this quote from Poincaré. He says that science is built up of facts as a house is built up of stones. So we need those facts. We need those research methods if we're going to understand why relationships are going to be good or struggle or how they work. But an accumulation of facts is no more a science than a heap of stones is a house. We need more than the facts. We need a way to guide us toward collecting certain facts and interpreting certain facts as being especially relevant or not. And when we get to this point, when we get to this challenge, which is to move beyond individual bits of knowledge and get to a bigger sense, a bigger understanding of guiding principles, ideas, explanations, now we need theories, okay? There's some ideas that I want to take you through fairly quickly. It probably is material you've covered in other classes you've had, like social psychology or abnormal psychology. So this won't be entirely new to you, but I do want to phrase it in a particular way because we have to think specifically what a theory of relationships is going to hold in store for us. A theory is a kind of a caricature, right? So if you go down to Venice Beach, lots of times there's a guy down there with a sketch pad, right? And he's going to draw a picture of you and your girlfriend or you and your dog or just you, right? There's going to be this guy and he's going to draw a picture of you and it's not going to look like you much. It's going to exaggerate the one feature of you that seems so extreme, right? If you've got a bushy beard, it's going to be this monstrous beard. If you've got a nose that's really tiny, it's going to be the tiniest nose in the world, right? If you've got big blue eyes, they're going to be huge. So a theory is a kind of a caricature. It takes a portrait, a snapshot of reality, and then it says, this stuff really matters, the stuff I'm going to blow up and expand. The other stuff, your chin, the clothes you're wearing, you got this little shrivelly body underneath, I'm not so concerned about that. I want to depict you in a way that really exaggerates what I think represents you best. So that's what a theory is. I like to think of a theory that way, as it exaggerates some features of nature, in this case, not you or your face or your dog, but something about nature, and then it ignores or minimizes other features. And another word for a theory is a model, like a model car or a model airplane, right? So a model looks like the real thing, but it doesn't have certain features, right? It takes certain features away and adds other features, and it gives us a simpler version, what we hope is a simple but potent explanation for why the world works the way it does. And in our case, that means why relationships are sometimes amazing and sometimes difficult. The features that are emphasized within this caricature or this model are seen as being especially important for capturing, representing, or explaining some phenomenon, right? So a theory is an intellectual device, a tool that we use that allows us to collect information from all of those research methods that I talked about in class on Thursday, and it allows us to explain something. Theories help us to guide our attention and explain something that matters. So here is a theory of the people who live in the apartment above you, right? So you have to try to make sense of, why are they so noisy all the time? Why are they always clunking around in the morning? I'm trying to sleep. They get up late at night and they're dropping stuff on the floor. Why aren't they more considerate? This is the theory, right? So it's an exaggeration of their shoes. Their shoes are huge because that's how you explain this invisible phenomenon in the apartment going on above you, right? And so there's this dog who's always barking. There's a woman who's on the verge of dropping stuff. And just for good measure, they have really ugly furniture and terrible art. So a theory is a caricature, and it helps us to make sense of something. That's the way we make sense of what's going on. It might be wrong, or it might be right, but it's a starting point for an explanation. What we hope to do is constantly evolve toward better explanations. So now we can say, okay, that's what a theory is. That's what a theory does for us. What do we want a theory of intimate relationships? What do we want that to do for us? Why would we entertain that notion? How might that be distinct? Well, at the end of our first lecture, I talked about all the different topics we're going to cover in this class, right? And you can see from that there are characteristics of you, personality traits of your partner, how you were raised, how you met, the struggles that you're going through right now, the beliefs that you have about relationships, the belief your partner has about relationships, what the economy is doing right now. All of these factors are likely to come to bear in some way on how our relationship works. So relationships are complex, probably, and largely unexplored, and so our theories should be comprehensive. They should include a lot of relevant, seemingly pertinent material, right? So there has to be breadth. And in order to achieve that breadth, especially as we're getting started, we may need different perspectives. We may need to integrate different points of view. And what you're going to see today is 5 points of view, 5 theoretical perspectives on relationships that I want you to understand. I want you to be able to, when you see something happening in your relationship or your parents' relationship or your friend's relationship or watching an episode of Friends on TV, I want you to say, oh, that's what that theory is. This theory that I know about, one of these 5 theories, is directly relevant to that phenomenon. And so we're going to cover 5 of them in the rest of class today. But in terms of what a good theory of close relationships does for us, it shouldn't just have lots of different stuff in it. It shouldn't just have breadth. It should have integration. It should tell us something about how A leads to B leads to C, right? So here's an example, not one I really expect you to know. This isn't, a lot of what I tell you in this class are details, and I don't want you to understand the details, I want you to understand the principles that are behind the details. So the principle is, let's connect different levels of analysis. So I have a theory, I have an idea about relationships, which is that a lot of what happens in our relationships, a surprising amount of what happens in our relationships, is a reflection of what happens outside of our relationships. So I published a paper recently indicating that the amount of discrimination that people experience outside their relationships, in the workforce, when they're out in the street, when they're just living their lives, the amount of discrimination people experience is related to how happy they are in their relationship. It's also related to how verbally hostile they are toward their partner under certain circumstances, and the circumstances relate to ethnic identity. For people who really have a strong identity of who they are and what their culture allows them to be, the effects of discrimination tend to go away, right? So that is an example, an illustration of this idea that you've got discrimination, you've got identity, someone's personal view of themselves, and that connects into the inner workings of our relationships, right? I don't want you to know that finding, but I want you to realize that that's an illustration of how theory can help us to connect different levels of analysis, different parts of the puzzle. And as I've indicated, theory should specify mechanisms of change. How is it that relationships start in one place with all that great feeling, all that positive emotion, and then change over time? Change maybe to be less erotic and less sexual and more of a friendship. How does that happen? What happens if people don't make that transition? How do relationships change when, as we talked about in class last week, when children arrive? How exactly does that change occur? What sorts of adjustments do people need to make if they're going to thrive in that circumstance or really become devastated and compromised by it? Okay, so we also want a theory that helps us to understand how the inputs, I like to think about how the inputs, your background, your personality, your partner's personality, where you met, how you met, the other people around you, how jealous you get when you see your partner hanging around other people of the opposite sex, how that all goes and translates into a developmental change within your relationship. So one of the things we ask of a theory, and it's a lot to ask of a theory, is how do relationships change? So here are the 5 different perspectives I want you to know about. And you'll see probably 4 of these on the midterm. Okay? They're not going to be hard. Once you sort of lock in on the basic idea, you'll recognize these immediately. And what I want to do today is help you to see these ideas, to understand them in the abstract, to understand them with specific reference to our critical question. And then I want to show you a videotape of a couple and show you how they actually emanate directly from the videotapes that we can see. So here are the 5 models. And our question is, how does each of these theories, which exist outside the domain of relationships, how do they connect to real phenomena in intimate relationships? They have to be something more than a distant, abstract tool. They have to say, if you know the theory, you have to say, I see that in my relationship. I see that happening all the time. Now I understand why men tend to be so inclined to be oriented toward defending themselves and not really wanting to open up about their feelings. Now I get it. There's an evolved reason for why that might be true. And that is what I want you to do. Connect these theories, these abstract ideas, into what happens on a daily basis in relationships. So let's start with the first one. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly so we have enough time to make sense of the video. This is Charles Darwin on the top. That is David Buss, a well-known evolutionary psychologist at the University of Texas. And the question I'm posing here is, why would we think about this as a theory that has anything to do with relationships? And here's the answer. Humans seek, and I believe this is a direct quote from David Buss. And I don't need you to know this quote. I need you to know the gist of this quote. Humans seek particular mates to solve specific adaptive problems that their ancestors confronted, right? So we have to recognize that we are the longer-term reflection of adaptive challenges that our distant ancestors once faced. Mate preference and mate decisions are hypothesized to be strategic products of selection pressures operating during ancestral conditions. That sounds like mumbo-jumbo, right? That's how academics talk to each other, by the way, often with jargon and mumbo-jumbo. Ancestral conditions. That's the challenges that our ancestors faced thousands and thousands of years ago to survive and adapt and reproduce. Okay, that's what that means. Mate preferences, what I'm looking for in a mate, and my decisions about who I mate with. Remember, evolutionary theorists really care about our genes moving across generations, right? So who we choose to mate with and all the decisions we make about mating are hypothesized to be strategic products of selection pressures. Selection pressures, that refers to the idea that certain genes move forward over time, other genes do not. What are the pressures that govern how that happened, right? So some of them are going to be the healthiness of the mate that you choose. Some of them are going to be the resources available for supporting and protecting new life. Okay? So just try to characterize this language for an evolved model. That's what evolution says about why we should care about relationships. Because it affects our propensity, our ability and proclivity to get our genes into the next generation. Okay? That's very different from an attachment and early experience point of view. Okay? So this is attachment theory. And attachment theory is typically associated with Mary Ainsworth and John Bowlby. You'll see their names in the text. And this perspective fully acknowledges evolution as a powerful force in our lives. But it goes one step further, and it says what really matters is the caregiver relationship, the relationship between the developing infant and the caregiver. Usually the mother, but not always. Okay? So the attachment point of view says, oh, it's about the relationship. And probably more than any of the models that I'm going to be presenting, it is an interpersonal model. Okay? It really says that we have this capacity within us to form relationships, and that our ability to form those relationships determines our survival. Without a caregiver, we don't survive. And the nature of that relationship, interestingly enough, something about the way that we relate to our caregiver and our caregiver relates to us creates psychological structures, working models, psychological structures that are kind of like a software program that determine how we're going to respond in other relationships. Let me read the formal version of this. So why would we adopt this perspective? Child-caregiver interactions give rise to working models of attachment, sort of like a software program, right? So this is a model that we have in our head. We create certain expectations for how people are going to treat us. We have certain tendencies to respond to people that are a reflection of the relationships that we've been in. And those working models of attachment are going to guide our subsequent thoughts, our subsequent feelings, and how we behave in relationships. Okay? Oversimplifying, the way you've been treated in prior relationships, especially powerful relationships when we were all growing up, that's going to matter somehow. Okay? And as one of my clinical supervisors used to say, you give as good as you get. You give as good as you get. If you've been nurtured and taken care of and you've been supported in your life, then you've developed those working models of attachment that allow you to do that for other people. Obviously, it's more complicated than that, You can learn to overcome difficult histories. But at least from a simple point of view, that's the attachment model. We'll have a lot to say about attachment in this class. There's another model, and it's called the Interdependence Model or the Social Exchange Model. Okay? If you, and I hope you've had a chance to go to my YouTube channel and look at that playlist with the expert interviews and look at the, I don't know, it's an 8 or 10 minute clip that we prepared on the theories. They lay out these different theoretical perspectives particularly well. I hope you get a chance to look at that because even better than hearing me talk about it is that those clips are each of the main theoretical models by people who have really done the research in those domains. So I hope you get a chance to look at those clips on the YouTube channel. Social exchange. Why would we think about social exchange? Social exchange theorists would say, I get it. Evolution makes sense. Attachment makes sense. But there's something else going on. There is a weighting. There's an evaluation going on in our heads. Sort of like an economist makes decisions. This is very much, even though it's called social exchange, it's not as exchange-oriented as you might be led to believe. It's a little bit more in the head than it's an exchange model. And according to this view, partners evaluate the rewards and costs of being in a relationship. They evaluate the rewards and costs of being in a relationship, along with the barriers to leaving the relationship and their available alternatives. Again, that's a lot of mumbo-jumbo, right? That's how academics talk. The idea is that as you're making decisions about whether to move into a relationship, whether to keep going in a relationship, you ask questions about how rewarding is this? How good is this? And even though it might be really good at sometimes, maybe there are costs that outweigh that, right? So that's one of the factors that goes into our thinking. Another decision that we're making in our heads is that even if the costs are high in this relationship, I don't like the way I feel in this relationship, I'm losing out on opportunities, the rewards aren't quite what they would be, guess what? You have some barriers to leaving. And those are going to lock you in place. Okay? So a social exchange theorist says, well, what are your options? What can you do? What are the barriers to you to getting out of this arrangement that you've created? And what are the alternatives that you've had? So you might have a relationship with lots of rewards, with very few rewards, lots of costs, low barriers to leaving, right? So maybe you're in a committed partnership, it's been going on for a couple years, it's not as good as it could be. The barriers to you leaving are very low. You both have an apartment, you don't have shared bank accounts, you don't have any children. So the barriers to leaving are low, but guess what? You might not have any alternatives. So you stay in a relationship that ain't so great, right? So that's the logic that goes into a social exchange perspective, okay? So it's a sort of an in-the-head weighting, an evaluation along these exact dimensions, okay? So those are, even though we can all recognize those as terms that we would use in general conversation, these are actually very specific terms within the context of social exchange, okay? Now, I want to contrast social exchange with social learning. And I know from previous experience teaching this material that if there's two models that you're going to sort of struggle to separate, it's social exchange and social learning. And the key here is that social learning is really about learning, okay? So if I'm in a relationship and every time my partner says, you know, honey, I'd like to tell you about how my day's been. My partner says this to me, and I say, you know, I'm a little busy right now. Or I say, she tells me, and I say, well, good luck with that, you know. Or that actually, I actually, you know, I'm just not that concerned. I've got other things on my mind. You know, I think you can handle this on your own. Eventually, my partner is A, not going to like me, and B, they're not going to bring those issues to me anymore. right? So I have, in effect, created a circumstance where her doing this behavior, my partner disclosing, engaging, wanting to connect up with me, I've said, it's not so important to me. And that would shape her to say, oh, next time around, why would I do something that's punishing? Why would I do something uncomfortable? So partners do not that exact thing, certainly. Partners shape one another all the time in relationships, right? When your partner says something to you, and disclosure, it turns out, is really critical in relationships. We'll talk a lot about disclosure, especially as we get into maintaining relationships, communicating closeness. Moments of disclosure, which have great potential for us connecting with our partner, really become circumstances in which this sort of shaping, this sort of learning takes place all the time. And that is usually a kind of what we would call Skinnerian learning or operant conditioning. You say X to me, and if I respond in a punishing way, what you just did is likely to happen less and less often in the future. Okay? So social learning theorists, people like Gayla Margolin, who's at USC, Robert Weiss, University of Oregon, the late Neil Jacobson, who was at the University of Washington, they developed this perspective based partly on social exchange theory that said we need to pay attention to this shaping process because there are rewarding and punishing interactions in our relationship. Not just in my head, that's social exchange theory, right? But we really have these kinds of conversations. They're observable in theory with a diary study or an observational study. I can actually see rewarding exchanges. You disclose something and I say, well, tell me more about that. I need to know about that. That seems important. Let's talk about that. Or the punishing, the opposite, which is, take it somewhere else. It just doesn't matter that much to me. It's a real interaction. Okay, it's not just in my head. That's separate. That's the social exchange, how I do the adding up and the subtracting and think about my alternatives and barriers, right? And when I have these conversations, I make judgments about how satisfied I am in the relationship, right? Part of what I do when I'm making judgments about satisfaction is I'm saying, how well are we treating each other, right? And we learn in the context of our relationship whether our relationship is a good place to be. It's interesting, isn't it, to think that in our relationship, we're constantly training one another, we're constantly teaching one another about whether our relationship is a good and rewarding place to be. Okay, so that's the fourth one. And remember, the key idea to pinpoint is the shaping, the social learning component, and that is what distinguishes it from social exchange. Okay, let's talk about the fifth model. The fifth one is really interesting. It was really a reflection of work by the person on the bottom, the late Yuri Bronfenbrenner, a psychologist at Cornell University, and Reuben Hill, a sociologist who worked primarily in the 40s and 50s. And this line of thinking argues that while you and I might be really fascinated by the psychology of the individuals and what goes on in the conversations and how she said something and it changed this about him, and even though she said something nice, he evaluated it as punishing from a social exchange point of view, things like that. Even though you and I can get really interested in the nuances of individual psychologies and the dynamic exchange of two people hanging out together and doing stuff together, these people say, granted, all of that's true. I'm not denying that that's true, but there's a context, right? So you might recognize, everybody in this room probably recognizes that I have a specific kind of culture that I grew up with, right? My culture has certain expectations of what's appropriate in relationships, how fast things should go in relationships. When you introduce your partner to your parents, there are cultural prescriptions that affect our relationships. That's a social ecology. That's an ecological point. It's about the context, the surrounding pressures that somehow find their way into our relationship. The discrimination example that I gave you earlier was certainly an example of that, right? So what I like to think about is take a relationship, right? Two people in a relationship. One relationship, no discrimination whatsoever. Both partners go out in the world and it's typical, it's average, it's not a problem. Another relationship, two people go out in the world and they're challenged. They feel threatened when they go out in the world. They don't feel adequate. Their self-esteem is always challenged. Even though they're otherwise identical relationships, things are going to happen. Things are going to transpire between those relationships, even in ways that affect what I'm willing to disclose and how I can respond to your disclosure. Those contexts, those outside forces are going to matter. And that's because relationships exist in particular socio-cultural contexts, which affect judgments and expectations about relationships. And in addition, when we're in relationships, we have to adapt to a lot of stress. Okay, this is really subsumed within this perspective is a stress idea. And you might know this intuitively, that when your relationship is under stress, when you're under stress, it comes into your relationship, right? And that is a social ecological point of view. Okay, so those are the 5 big models. I just want to show you this graph real quickly. This was on the title slide. Let me get my pointer here. This is from one of my studies that I'm conducting right now with Dr. Carney. And this is one couple, believe it or not. And you don't need to know this. What you need to know is that this kind of thing illustrates a bigger principle, which is social ecological perspectives, right? That's what you need to know. So if you look right there, where's my pointer? You see that black dot right there? You see that one right there? And you see that one? Those are 2 spouses. They're married, okay? We go into their homes and we interview each one of them separately. And we say, we would like you to tell us everybody who's in your social network. Tell us everybody who's in your social network. Parents, coworkers, friends, family, everybody. Tell us who's in your social network. And then we're going to do something really hard. We're going to go through each pair of people in your network, and we're going to say, do those people know each other? And do they like each other? Okay? So each person's doing this. And you can see that if they know each other, you put a line between them. Right? And what you can do is you can say, okay, so I've got Betty over here and Joe over here. They've both told me about their social networks and who knows one another within their own social networks. But then I can also say, does Joe's brother know somebody in Betty's social network? And does Betty know Joe's brother? Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, right? Does Joe's best friend know Betty? And now, those are the purple dots. Those are the both alters. You see those purple dots? It's a little hard to see, but right around the couple themselves, those are the people who know, the people in your network who know you and your partner. Then there are other people, and these are the red dots. These are the husband. These are the people who only know the husband, but don't know anybody that the wife doesn't know. So these might be people in the husband's job, for example, right? See these red ones? Those are sort of out to the side. And the wife, the blue one, has her own as well. The idea is, with carefully structured interviews, and again, the details of this don't matter. The point matters. And the point is, those 2 people in those 2 black dots, they are affected by the people around them. And we can ask really specific questions about how networks work. So for example, one of the things we're studying is if, and this happens, okay, do your partner's parents like you? Do your partner's parents like you? If they don't, that might be a contextual risk factor for your relationship. We might wonder why they don't like you, and maybe there are characteristics of your background or different cultural values or different experiences that you've had in your life that lead your partner's parents to say, we don't like this guy. We know you can do better than that guy, right? And only by mapping out the full array of relationships that your relationship is embedded in can we start to answer those questions. We also ask questions like, who within your network could loan you a significant amount of money if you got into trouble? That might really matter when you're under stress, right? So this is an illustration of a contextual perspective on relationships. We have dozens and dozens of these, and we're making sense of how they exist, how they change. You might imagine, for example, that these will change dramatically when a child arrives, when all of a sudden you might have much more contact with family members, and your friends might sort of get pushed out to the side, right? So that's an example of a contextual perspective. Okay, those are the 5 models. And what I want to do is now give you a quick quiz. We're going to do it all together. And the quiz is really in relation to our critical question. Okay, so we've all heard 5 perspectives. Our critical question is, why do some long-term committed partnerships end while others continue and thrive and do great and provide a nurturing, great environment for the mental, physical, and emotional well-being of the partners and their children? Okay, so here's the first model. Which model is this? Why are relationships good? Well, here's an answer. Partners evaluate exchanges in their relationship as being insufficiently rewarding, overly costly. Barriers like children and finances are not sufficient to keep people in the relationship, and the perceived availability of alternative partners draws people out of the relationship. What's that? Social exchange, right? Social exchange. So it's an evaluation in the head of rewards and costs, barriers, and alternatives. Okay? Let's see if we can. Oh, I didn't do that thing. Okay, here's one. We've not evolved to have committed relationships. That's not why we're on this planet. We've evolved to send our genes into the future, by the way, which is a lot more fun, turns out. Committed relationships do enhance the fitness of our offspring, but infidelity, well, that's a pretty good way of spreading your genes as well. So an evolutionary point of view is not always about the sustaining characteristics of our relationships. It's often about what the invisible struggles are that we're going through. So this is evolution, right? Relationships deteriorate because partners haven't acquired the skills they need to manage their conflicts and differences of opinion. They haven't acquired the skills. What's that sound like? Sounds like high school algebra, right? Like, oh, it's a skill. I need to learn something. I grew up in a family where my parents didn't resolve conflict very well, or they were really nurturing and supportive, and I sort of get that. Like when my partner comes to me, I remember that my mom used to go to my dad, and my dad used to really be great and warm and friendly. Like, I get that. I learned that. You're in a real sense. Which one's this? This is social learning theory. Social learning. So there's an acquisition. And mismanaged conflict, seeing mismanaged conflict, breeds further conflict or disagreement to the point where partners conclude that the relationship is no longer satisfying and viable. Okay? So this is a learning model. It's a learning perspective. What's interesting is right now in the field, there's a very interesting debate going on between this idea that, oh, if relationships are all about stuff that you learn, then we can just train people to be great relationship partners. Another model says, actually what you need to tap into are these core experiences of attachment. And if you don't reveal those core experiences, then it doesn't really matter what people are going to learn, right? So there are different competing ideas about what the intervention should be like if you adopt these different theoretical perspectives, right? So part of what's interesting about a theory is not just that it helps us to organize information and decide what new information to collect. It's also a springboard to interventions. We say, well, how do we improve relationships? If relationships can sometimes be a source of difficulty in people's lives. And as I've said before, relationships are one of the primary reasons why anybody seeks any kind of counseling in the US. If that is true, what sort of theoretical perspectives can we bring to bear on making relationships better? And if you're a social ecologist, you're going to come up with a really different answer than if you're a social learning theorist, right? Social ecologists would say, well, let's make lives less stressful for everybody in general. Okay, I don't need to talk to people. Let me just make their lives less stressful. A social learning theorist would say, I need to get in there, work with individual couples, and actually enable them to have more rewarding conversations. So this is clearly an acquisition model, and it's a learning-based model, so that is social learning theory. Relationships falter. Here's another point of view. Relationships falter because partners must contend with a host of stressful transitions, difficult life events, and chronic circumstances that compromise, tax, and otherwise hinder intimate connection between partners. Social ecology, right? There it is. I probably could have added some content about different cultural backgrounds and expectations that would have been equally appropriate within that model. And here's the last one. Committed relationships end because some partners enter relationships with internal working models, that's the key, right? Internal working models that do not permit them to provide or receive the nurturing needed for any relationship to thrive. So it's not that they have, it's not so much a learning-based mechanism as it is an exposure to a caregiver that has left them with internal psychological structures, a sort of a code that allows them to say, when we have an argument, do I disengage and flee, or do I try to ask my partner what's going on? What do I do in that moment, right? And that moment, how we respond in that moment, is supposed to be a reflection of the moments that we had in our relationship with a caregiver when we were 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. So in this model, which is, of course, attachment, insecurities leak out, and those insecurities are a reflection of where we've been in other relationships and the relationship struggles. There are emotional dysregulations that the individual themselves cannot manage. They present that to their partner can't manage, and that, from this point of view, is why the relationship ends. Okay, what I'm going to do now is show a videotape of Frank and Nadine. And by now, I hope you've at least know that there are two pieces of paper that will help you a great deal. One is a listing of different, you can almost read it there. One is a listing of theories. Let's hold on to that one for a minute. The other one is just sort of a blow-by-blow description of what happens in the video, okay? So let's watch the video, and time permitting, it is 11:43 right now, time permitting, we'll come back and try to say what we saw in the videos that connect to those 5 theoretical models, okay? You with me on that? So I got 2 pieces of paper. One is just a blow-by-blow description, sort of just so you can keep track of what's going on in the video, where they are, what they're talking about, because the video does fly by, I get that. So we're going to see this, Nadine and Frank. Then what we're going to do is say, oh, how does this connect up to specific theories? And that's what the second sheet is about, okay? One thing you might want to do to simplify the task a little bit is pick the model that you like the best. Like, as you heard those 5 models, you say, oh, that really makes sense. Like that attachment theory, oh my goodness, that makes total sense. That has to be, that in the end, that's going to be the winner. Or you might say, oh, it's all about social ecology. Whichever model you like the best, think about that one as you look through the tape and use that as your filter for looking at what Nadine and Frank are going to do, okay? So let's play this. I'll turn on some lights. Okay, so that is Frank and Nadine. They are a test case for us. Not all relationships, fewer these days, in fact, formalize themselves into committed partnerships. But Frank and Nadine have gotten married. And one of the questions we can ask one of the realizations is, how would you study that? How do you study the enormous complexity of human intimacy, right? It's kind of interesting to wonder about. It's one of the challenges of this course and for relationship science. There we go. Sorry. Another thing we can ask is, what's our projection on how their relationship is going to be? What do you think? How many people think they're going to have the happy, fantastic relationship? Bunch of skeptics in the room. There's one optimist. Thank you very much. Thursday after the exam, we're going to watch the next installment. By the way, have any of you heard of the director Michael Apted in the 7 Up series? He is the director of this series as well. And one of the, this is a great documentary series. I think it's on YouTube right now. Or at least Netflix. It's on Netflix. So we see a couple and we learn about them. We learn from this 12, 15-minute interview a lot of information, maybe not enough to make a projection of where their relationship is going to be. Remember, that's our critical question. What is it about a relationship that gives it longevity, that gives it quality, that allows people to grow and change and become even better versions of who they are? What is it in our relationships? My point in this exercise, and what I now want to hear from you, is what did you see through the specific 5 theoretical lenses that we outlined in the beginning of class? What did you see that helps us orient to different phenomena in their lives? Let's start off with attachment theory, and we can refer to the notes as we go, right? So what did you see in the video, this short video, that would let you to say, I see where attachment comes in? What did you see? Yeah.
Frank describing how his mom and Nadine are like the same person, and like his mom is dead, so maybe in a sense, like he doesn't think that he's looking for his mom and Nadine, but like Nadine sort of replaces his mom as an attachment figure if they give him the same kind of social support.
Right. So the idea is that point about where they were on the couch, and they were talking about how much Nadine, for Frank, resembles his own mother. The idea being, and this is in fact one of the ideas in attachment theory, I didn't highlight it this morning, but it's evident in the video, which is that what we do in our lives is that in complex ways, we get our attachment needs met with different people. Early on, it's with a caregiver. Later on, it's with friends in our peer group, and maybe eventually it stays with friends, or however we manage our intimate lives. For Frank and Nadine, it appears to be the case that he is, in some significant sense, replacing his mother and his image and memory of his mother with Nadine, right? So that would be an example of attachment theory. Excellent. Other illustrations of attachment theory that you saw. Remember, what we're looking for is that idea that something about the early caregiving relationship sort of manifested itself in a working model that now affects how Frank and Nadine approach one another in their current relationship. Yeah, in the back.
Two things. One, the fact that, as you were saying before, the mother was so similar, it allows him to interact with her in a similar manner. He has like a passion.
Yeah, he's got a script, like he's got it figured out. Like what does he say at one point? Oh, they're like they're like identical. Like, it's scary how much she's like my mom, right? So that sort of greases the wheel for subsequent interaction. Excellent point.
And then secondly, his views on how her daughter should interact with her biological father.
Yeah, so his views on what Jordan should be, her relationship should be with Jordan's biological father, right? So he sees the value in that because his father took off when he was young, right? Comment on that? Okay, cool. Other stuff on the attachment side? Stuff that really jumped out. Yeah, right here in red.
When she talked about how her parents were married for 40 years and how she wants her relationship to resemble that.
Right, so one of the things attachment theorists think about, and you've heard me say it several times already, is this idea of a model, right? And that is, we heard it before, now we're hearing again, is this idea that the experiences that I had when I was growing up, usually with a caregiver, usually a parent, not always, that sort of left a residue, that left a set of expectations, a way that I orient to how I believe the world should be. And your point is that for Nadine, she saw her parents in a long-standing committed partnership, a marriage that lasted 40 years, I think she said, and that is part of her script. That's part of her expectation of what this new relationship should be, right? So that's the intergenerational continuity. You will hear about that right before the exam. That is believed to be true, connecting the relationships that we grew up in with the relationships that we're now thinking about forming or that we may form later in life. Okay, any other thoughts on attachment? So the idea, remember the idea is we can get these theoretical lenses in front of us and actually see instances of that phenomenon in even a 12-minute clip, okay? How about evolutionary models? Who picked evolution as a core theme, and what did you see? Yeah.
Nadine had said that she wanted him to get a job that's more safe.
Yeah.
Rather than do baseball. She also wanted him to continue going to school, probably, to get a higher rating.
Right. So excellent point. So Nadine is really invested in Frank, not as a crazy minor league baseball player, but as someone who's not going to get hurt, who's going to really be an income provider. Right. She's a solid income earner. But she wants a person who's going to be able to provide resources for her and Jordan. Excellent. What else did we see on that point? Yeah.
He was nervous about getting married.
He's nervous. Yeah. What would that be? Why would that be linked in any way to evolutionary theory?
Because males don't necessarily settle down, but women want to.
The argument can be entertained that if the evolutionary model says get your genes into the future, which, by the way, is not have great relationships and get your genes into the future generations. It's have more relationships. Somehow we might wonder about whether there are psychological mechanisms that get engaged when a person says, wait a minute, am I investing too much in this one relationship? Maybe that's locking me in to too few opportunities to get my genes moving forward. That's an argument. Other arguments? Yeah.
The stress he talked about with his stepdaughter and the relationship with her father, and the stress in that relationship, where he's saying that he needs to be more part of life, the kid's life, and have that stress.
Yeah, so there's this idea in evolutionary theory that that we want resources, right? We want partners with resources, and that historically, women in particular have sought out men who would provide them with resources. Given that there are now more social roles that women can function in and earn a living, those demands have changed over time. But there's this idea that more resources by a partner are going to be better for us. And at the same time that how those resources get divided up across different offspring is going to matter, right? So that we have evolved a capacity to say, look, if you're going to be my partner, you're going to need to invest your resources in me and my offspring, not in other offspring that you might have. Other issues on the evolutionary side? Yeah.
He assumed that she already had a boyfriend, kind of making it so that she was a suitable mate.
Yeah, he saw her as attractive, right? And so he assumed that she already had a partner, which would be psychologically, we could imagine that having an evolved basis, right? Excellent. Yeah.
She was nervous about him being younger than her.
She was nervous about him being younger. Why would that be important?
Could that also be because of the fact that the male has to provide and generally they're older than the female?
Right. In most relationships, in most married relationships, in my studies at least, the man is about 18 months older than the woman. It's very consistent. And she's saying, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't seem right. And that we can see that as kind of a cue that she's saying, shouldn't he be like the bigger dude in this relationship? Like, shouldn't he be the power player when it comes to an income? That's what I want. So why would that matter? Like, it doesn't really make sense unless you start to attach some sort of evolutionary interpretation behind it. Okay, great. What about social exchange? Now remember, social exchange is all about rewards, costs, barriers, and alternatives. What do we see with this? Yeah? Right, so one of the costs was a little uncertainty for him. Like there was a lack of absolute certainty that this was the relationship. He was reading something into that and saying, I'm a little uncertain about this. What other rewards, costs, barriers? Yeah.
Nadine was able to have a father figure for the daughter.
So
that was a reward for her because she was really frightened of whether or not her potential partner would be a good influence on her daughter. So now he became a father figure.
He became an asset for her. So part of how she's weighing in her head whether this is a good idea to move forward, whether this is going to be a good relationship, is the fact that she noticed that he got along well with Jordan, the daughter. And that, for her, is like, oh, this is a good idea. I see good things here. Yeah.
Isn't like another potential cause is him putting his like energy into the child, which is not his, so using his resources to...
Right, that could also be interpreted as a cost. So anything that he is doing that wouldn't be sustaining her and Jordan and how their lives would be together would be interpreted as a cost, absolutely. Yeah.
For him, he has the benefit of a steady income source from her, so he has the ability to go off and pursue in the minor league and go back to school because she's making money.
For him.
Yeah.
So he can see her as a source of security. And she has great stability, and if you are looking for a partner, that is a very good resource. Excellent. Other barriers, alternatives, do we hear anything about that? Yeah.
I just think another reward was she was really looking for someone to help her cope with the health of her mother, and he had already experienced losing his mother, and she made the comment like, I feel like he was sent to me for a reason because I needed someone to understand, and he really understood too, like she doesn't want someone to smother her with care, just like that kind of like invisible support.
Yes, excellent. So part of what she found valuable was his ability to really understand what's going on, especially as she dealt with the stress of her mom being very, very ill. Excellent. Okay. So you start to see the rewards and the costs. You also can begin to see that the rewards associated, say, with the mom, that Nadine thinking that Frank would be a real asset to her, didn't need to be articulated that much, right? It didn't need to be a learning process. It was just, this is how this registers for me. This goes into the plus column, right? So there wasn't quite that same necessarily a learning sequence there. What else did we see on the social exchange side? How about social learning? Yeah.
His comment about, she pushes me, but not as much as I would like.
Yeah.
So that was, just sort of an instance of him trying to get her to be a different behavior.
Right. He's learned that he's the kind of guy who needs to get pushed. And when Michael Apted, the interviewer, said, does she do that? Does she make you feel good and strong and capable? He said, yeah, but not as I've learned, that not as much as I need. And so that could become a kind of a conversation for them. It could be a source of tension for them in the future. So, for example, if he fails at something, he can kind of blame her for that, right? She's on the hook for that a little bit. Excellent. Yeah.
It seemed like he learned not to point out her flaws. Like she was saying, yeah, you got a couple, and then she wanted
Yeah.
She wanted to kind of like take it back, but then he had learned at some point not to say it.
Right, there was this really cute moment. Perfect. Let's just do this 1 second. Just give me 1 second on this. This idea that they were talking about how well they got along, what they liked about each other, whether they had flaws. And she was willing to acknowledge that he had some flaws. And when the interviewer said, does she have any flaws? He said, no, not a single flaw. As though he had learned, that might be evidence that he had learned that when he raises that, a criticism, that's costly, right? He's learned something about how to manage her. Okay.